All right. Today I'm speaking with David Barron, a seasoned science writer who has contributed to many of the major American journalism outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. He was a longtime science correspondent for NPR, and his TED Talk on the experience of solar eclipses has been viewed millions of times. His last book, American Eclipse, won the American Institute of Physics Science Writing Award in 2018. Today, we'll be discussing his new book, The Martians, the true story of an alien craze that captured turn of the century America. The alien craze in the subtitle of your book is the story of how, for about a decade at the beginning of the 20th century, many people came to believe that the planet Mars held not only life, but a complex civilization. The person most responsible for popularizing this view as an established scientific fact was Percival Lowell. Lowell functions as a main character in your book. I want to thank you for joining me today. And at what point in your reporting for this book did it become clear that Lowell would function as a central figure in your story?
Oh, pretty much I knew that from the start. So, I first learned about the so-called canals on Mars um, from Carl Sagan. So, when I was in high school and watched the Cosmos series on PBS, he actually one episode was about Mars, and he talked about this astronomer Percival Lowell, who at the turn of the last century saw these weird lines on Mars that he believed were canals, irrigation canals. And it's remembered as one of the great blunders in science because it was an idea that really took off. What actually surprised me was not that Lowell was my main character, but just how many other people got swept up in this craze. I mean, really, some of them quite prominent and famous scientists and inventors who totally believed that in fact there was this civilization on Mars. So it was not just Percival Lowell, it was quite a collection of interesting characters.
Yeah, that's true. I guess one of the things that I found really interesting about your book is that you are yourself somewhat of a character in the book. You go and visit many of the archives around the world to do reporting for this. One of the things I found compelling about your portrait of Lowell was just how complex a figure he turns out to be. He's born into this Boston Brahmin family. He's got a brother who becomes the president of Harvard. His sister is Amy Lowell, who I think I remember reading in it's high school probably.
Right, a famous poet.
And he himself, right, wasn't he he was a major kind of public intellectual before he even gets into the astronomy business. And I guess I'm curious to hear how your view of Percival Lowell kind of evolved during the project, because it seems like there are times where you almost want to poke fun at him a little bit because I think you say at one point he's a young man who wanted for nothing. But as I delved into his character, I came to appreciate the prison he inhabited. For the scion of a famous lineage, the expectations weighed mightily.
Yeah, well, he was a fascinating character, came from a truly prominent family. So, right, the Lowells in Massachusetts made their fortune in textiles back in the early 1800s, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The city of Lowell, Massachusetts is named after the Lowells. And so Percival Lowell, here he is born into this family where much was expected. James Russell Lowell was a cousin. He was the founding editor of the Atlantic Monthly. So the Lowells were philanthropic. They gave a lot of money to Harvard. They helped in the founding of MIT. So yeah, so when he graduated from Harvard in 1876, he could do anything he wanted with his life. And at first, what he wanted to do was to travel. He spent a lot of time in the Far East, in Japan and in Korea, back when Asia was seen as this extremely exotic, otherworldly place. And he was sort of a roving anthropologist. He wrote about Asian cultures in best-selling books and in articles. And it actually, I mean, his fascination with, I mean, the people of Asia were called alien cultures,
Mhm.
alien beings, right? I mean, the other word meaning of the word alien. And when he read about the possibility of life on Mars, it was, I think, that same interest in other beings and other cultures that turned him to astronomy when he was about the age of 40. So yeah, but he was, you know, again, when I went into writing this book, having known the very basics of the story and how, history kind of laughs at Percival Lowell as someone who made this huge mistake in science. But I came to have more empathy when it came to him. That I actually think his theory about these canals on Mars was not crazy when he first proposed it in 1894. It was a little out there, but it was a coherent theory that explained these weird features being seen on Mars. It was not insane to think there could be life on Mars, maybe civilized life on Mars. But on the other hand, Percival Lowell had a huge ego, and I think a fragile ego, and could not accept any criticism of his theory. And the more people criticized it over time, the more he dug in his heels. And by the time he died in 1916, he was portraying himself as a persecuted genius who was not believed, but who in that someday would be seen as having been correct. He almost saw himself as the next Charles Darwin. I mean, a person of that importance. So it's a sad story in the end. But actually, I mean, he did a lot of good. He really inspired people to imagine life in outer space and helped inspire science fiction and even the early space scientists. So he did a lot of good as well as making a huge mistake.
Now, one of the things that I liked about the way you set up the story was that you really do show that he's not the first guy to have this idea of life on Mars. You talk about how there was a 100,000 franc uh, prize for whoever would be the first astronomer, French or foreign, who shall be able to communicate with any planet or star. You discuss at some length the French author Camille Flammarion, who promoted such ideas in the early 1860s in articles like magazine articles and books like The Plurality of Inhabited Worlds. You also talk about Giovanni Schiaparelli, who had these quite beautiful drawings of the Canali of Mars, and you point out that means channels, but was mistranslated. Um, how would you characterize the sentiment of the public towards Mars before Lowell got there? He comes in kind of at the beginning of the 20th century, but the public was sort of primed to take him seriously, right?
Right. So, as you said, this whole idea of canals on Mars started with Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was a prominent astronomer in Milan, in Italy. And it was in 1877 that he set out to make a detailed map of Mars. And he was the one who first reported this network of fine, extremely straight lines on Mars that he imagined were waterways of some sort. And as you say, he called them canali, which in Italian means channels, was mistranslated into English as canals. But and some people who talk about the canals on Mars will say, oh, it was all, of course, it was all just due to mistranslation. But that oversimplifies it. Yes, there was a mistranslation, but people knew it was a mistranslation, and it was sort of a joke for a while that there were canals on Mars, but that was the name given to these lines. It was Lowell in 1894 who then proposed that they really were canals. Now, not for navigation, but for irrigation. And that fit in with the idea about Mars that it was an older planet than Earth. And Lowell said it was running out of water. And indeed it is. I mean, billions of years ago, Mars did have water flowing on its surface. It has run out of water. Well, Lowell didn't know that, but he assumed that that was the case. And so if there was a civilization on Mars, and if Mars was running out of water, then the most important thing for the people of Mars would be to find a way to live on a dying planet, and that meant tapping the meltwater from the polar ice caps and bringing it down to their farms. So anyway, as you say, Giovanni Schiaparelli in 1877 talked about the canals on Mars. People started thinking about maybe there was a civilization there. Camille Flammarion, this great astronomer in France, very influential, believed there was life on Mars. So the idea was out there. And then even when Lowell came along in 1894, it still was seen as an interesting theory and kind of a joke. a little bit. But by the beginning of the 20th century, it became quite taken quite seriously to the point that in 1906, the New York Times was declaring there is intelligent life on Mars. 1907, the Wall Street Journal, one of the most serious newspapers in America, said that the biggest news of 1907 was the proof of intelligent life on Mars. So it went from sort of a frivolous idea to an interesting scientific theory to almost accepted fact before the first decade of the 20th century was done.
Yeah, but so as a man in my late 30s myself, I took some comfort in reading how Lowell was about this age when he took up astronomy, and it is quite remarkable how in 1893 he reads one of these books by Flammarion, and and I think you note he was fluent in French, so he reads the French edition. A few years later, he's already building an observatory near Flagstaff, Arizona, to make observations for himself. It seems like a daunting project for a public intellectual to who becomes interested in a scientific project to just use his own funds and make a new facility to investigate him for himself. Um, what conditions allowed Lowell to be able to pursue that?
Well, of course, he had very deep pockets. That was a big help. Uh, as I said before, he graduated from Harvard. His family was very much involved in Harvard in terms of serving on in various committees overseeing parts of the university. Lowell was involved with the astronomy department at Harvard, even though, I mean, he had taken science courses as an undergraduate, but he did not have advanced training in science. But he thought of himself as someone educated in science, and he was to some extent. And when he got actually, I should say, and I point this out in the book, the idea for the observatory in Arizona was not originally his. It was an astronomer at Harvard who was an acquaintance of his who had the idea that in 1894, when Mars and Earth were going to come especially close to each other, this astronomer named William Pickering at Harvard had the idea he wanted to set up a temporary observatory in Arizona to take advantage of the clear air there to study Mars. But Pickering could not find the funds for it. And he was an acquaintance of Lowell's, and Lowell thought it was a great idea. But if Lowell was going to provide the funds, he wanted to be in charge. So he hired William Pickering from Harvard for a time to help establish the observatory. So the observatory was established in Flagstaff. It's still there. The Lowell Observatory continues to do good work. Has a lot of scientific outreach. There's sort of a museum there. Anyone who goes through Flagstaff should visit. But so Lowell took this idea and actually took a couple of people from Harvard to help establish the observatory, used his own funds to buy one of the finest telescopes of the era, have it installed in Flagstaff. So, and then and it was not unheard of, far from it, in fact, at the time, for amateurs to get involved in astronomy and to do important work. There were quite a few folks who had been lawyers or doctors or merchants who would later in life use some of their free time to study the stars. So Lowell was following in their footsteps, but he had the funds to really do it in a grandiose way.
Now, as I understand it, someone like Flammarion was never quite as insistent about the canals being proof positive of culture on Mars the way that Lowell was. But as you referred to earlier, Lowell was he had a background as an interpreter of Eastern cultures for Westerners. He was writing articles about these sorts of things. He was writing books about these sorts of things. And I guess one interpretation is that he was primed psychologically to look for some sort of culture out in space, the way that maybe someone who is just trained in the sciences may not have. Um, it was interesting to me that there was quite a bit of uh, contentious evidence, even at that time, that this could have been a psychological projection, and this forms a big thread throughout your book.
Right. So I guess I should give a bit of a spoiler alert, but we're going to get there anyway. There are not canals on Mars. There never were canals on Mars. The way the story is remembered is this was all a case of an optical illusion that fooled a whole generation of people, of astronomers and so forth. And indeed, the lines, these exceptionally straight lines crisscrossing the planet that Lowell saw, that Flammarion saw, that Schiaparelli saw, were never there. In the end, the best explanation is that, people were studying Mars through telescopes, looking through the Earth's atmosphere that made perceiving the surface of Mars a very difficult thing to do. We could make out shapes, but you couldn't make out the details. And so the human eye, seeing things at the very limit of perception, tended to see patterns where there weren't any, to connect dots and see them as lines. And this was, even at the time, this was being proposed as a hypothesis that, well, not everyone saw the lines on Mars. And so there were a few astronomers, one being Walter Maunder, who was at the Greenwich Observatory in England, who had noticed that he was an expert on sunspots. And sunspots are these dark little freckles that you can see on the sun if you look at the sun through an appropriate filter. And he found that sometimes these little dots on the sun could look like lines, even though they weren't lines. And so he had the idea, well, maybe the same thing's happening on Mars. And he was pushing this idea for quite a while to the point where he conducted a really interesting study in 1903, where he enlisted a whole bunch of young schoolboys at a Greenwich school to draw what they saw when they were shown a kind of a map of Mars where the lines were erased and instead more naturalistic features were put in there. And when the boys had to draw this, and they were seated 20 or 30 feet away, and they couldn't quite make out what was there, even though there were no lines on this drawing of Mars, and they didn't know what they were drawing, but it was a strange shape, they drew lines. So it was possible to trick the human eye to see lines where there weren't any. But that's not proof that that's what was happening on Mars. It was just the possibility that that was happening on Mars. So this was out there. And in fact, the astronomical community was divided into these two warring camps that were really at each other's throats, that would later be called the Canalists and the anti-Canalists. So Lowell was the clear leader of the Canalist faction. Maunder and a few others were leading the anti-Canalists.
Yeah, and I think that one of the interesting things that your book highlights is that even though now we don't think there are canals on Mars, a lot of good things came out of the sort of drive to. I mean, I think in Lowell's view, it was to prove that there were canals on Mars, and two of them were that one. They were taking photographs of through their telescopes, and that was sort of new. And then the other one was that they were going and you document there were international expeditions to both Africa and South America to find better locations to take these photographs. So, I mean, in a way, it does seem like that sort of presages this more internationalist approach to science that we appreciate today.
Yeah, and I think this is a particularly sensationalistic and interesting case of science, which is why I wrote a book about it. But this is how science works, right? Science, you find something inexplicable, and then you come up with theories to explain it, and then you get the evidence to try to prove or disprove that the hypothesis is correct. And so Lowell, while his theory that the lines on Mars were due to an advanced civilization having built a canal network on Mars to irrigate their crops. While in the end that was wrong, that was a theory to be tested. And so people had to go out and find ways to test that. And that's good in terms of pushing science forward to try to explain something that's a mystery. And he went to North Africa with the idea he might move his telescope there. He didn't. But yeah, what I think is the kind of the climax of the book. It's just insane in retrospect. But in 1907, in an attempt to prove beyond any doubt that the canals were there, Lowell, having developed some new techniques of photography to be able to actually take photographs of Mars through a telescope, funded just a Herculean expedition to South America, where he hired an astronomer from Amherst College who also thought that the canals might be there to disassemble the 7-ton monster telescope at Amherst College in Massachusetts, pack it into 119 boxes, uh, put it on a ship from New York to Panama, take it across the isthmus by train because the canal wasn't done, put it on another ship to go down the west coast of Central and South America, get onto a train in northern Chile, up into the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, to then set up the telescope, reassemble it in the middle of nowhere, to take over 10,000 photographs of Mars at a time when Mars and Earth were coming closer together than they had been in years, and where the planet would be better seen from the southern hemisphere than the northern, which was why this was sent to South America. And so those 10,000 tiny photographs, just a quarter inch across, were then touted by Lowell and this astronomer, David Todd, as the proof that the canals were there. And the public accepted it. I mean, that's why in 1907, the Wall Street Journal said, we now have proof of life on Mars. And by 1908, you had pastors in church sermonizing about the Martians and saying how we should look to Mars as an example of what we should be, because the Martians were thought to be more peaceful and more moral than we are. And by 1909, there was talk of communicating with Mars, as there had been on and off over the years. And people were imagining what we could learn from those intelligent, moral beings across the void. So, so Lowell, he was investing his money. He was pushing people farther to actually do this research. And again, I think that's all for the good. In the end, he was wrong, but that's how science works.
Yeah, and I have to say, you include some of those photos in the book, and I can put myself in the place of somebody who's just a member of the public. If you looked at those photos and you said, "Well, he probably knows what he's talking about," you could, I'm sure, convince yourself he was right.
Yeah, well,
So
I mean, they were tiny, grainy photographs that even the originals, which I have seen, are kind of hard to make out. And anyway, I mean, in retrospect, if looking at Mars through a telescope can cause optical illusions to see lines, well, certainly the same thing can happen looking at a quarter-inch grainy photograph. You can just imagine, your mind can go all sorts of ways about imagining shapes that might be in there. But Lowell had these published in some of the most renowned publications, magazines of the time, as proof. And the tiny photographs he then accompanied with his own drawings showing what's really there. And you have to trust that his drawings that showed the canals beyond any doubt actually matched the photographs. But you had to trust that he was doing that right.
now, as you alluded to earlier, Lowell is not the only character in this book. There's a lot of interesting figures who come in and out, including Nikola Tesla makes a big part of the book. In your last book, in American Eclipse, you also talked a lot about Edison, and something I wanted to pull on with you a little bit was this idea that there seemed to be, at least at that point, and maybe throughout the history of technology, some of these men of action who seemed to make astounding technical breakthroughs, but they were somewhat out of step with academic science of their time. I mean, I guess Lowell is even more of an edge case because he's probably even further from the academic mainstream of the time. Um, do you see outsider scientists as being a main sort of a theme of your books?
Interesting question. I mean, Tesla and Edison, of course, were very different kinds of people, and they would say they were outside the mainstream in different ways. Um, Edison, yeah, in my book American Eclipse, which tells the true story of a total solar eclipse that crossed America's Wild West in 1878, and was kind of a defining moment for American science in terms of inspiring us to become a scientific power. There were many interesting people who went west for the eclipse, including Thomas Edison. And at that time, Edison saw himself as not just an inventor, but a scientist. And he was friendly with a bunch of academic scientists with whom he went to Wyoming. And then later, not too much later, had a falling out because, yeah, Edison was a showman. He was a salesman. He was trying to raise money, trying to put out practical inventions that would sell, and that at times put him at odds with the academic scientists who were very careful not to sensationalize and not to get ahead of the science, whereas Edison was very happy to tout his inventions even before he'd invented them, so he could raise the money to actually invent them. Tesla was different in a very different way. I mean, Tesla and Edison famously are seen as rivals. I mean, early on, Tesla worked for Edison for a brief time. They had a falling out. I think too much is made of their rivalry, but they did. I mean, famously engage in the War of the Currents, where Edison was promoting direct current electricity. It was Tesla who was promoting alternating current as more practical, and Tesla won, and Tesla was right. But Tesla himself was an outsider in a different way, which is he was really he was a visionary, which back then was the word was used as a pejorative, and I mean visionary in that he saw things that weren't real. I mean, that's good and bad. He imagined things that helped him with his inventions, but he was not a practical man. He was not good with money, and he would dream up these ideas that he would work on forever before bringing anything practical to market. And he had investors who needed to get their money back, and they gave up on him because he was too visionary and not practical enough. Edison was smartly very practical. He knew to focus on inventions that could actually make money, not just something that would save the world. Whereas Tesla was out to like completely revolutionize things and save the world, but he couldn't do it without the backing of millionaire investors. So anyway, it is interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, and Lowell too, of course, was an outsider. So I guess I am writing a lot about people who are a little outside the mainstream of science.
Well, I guess sort of that showman aspect is sort of maybe part of it. I guess another part of the Martians that was really intriguing to me was the way it sort of pulls back some of the layers on our shared cultural imagination around Mars and Martians. I know when I was in middle school, I enjoyed both the books War of the Worlds and Martian Chronicles, and I think to me they were both sort of equally fictional. They had nothing to do with reality, and I don't think what I really grappled with, certainly at that time, was that War of the Worlds was more of an attempt to really think through scientifically what would a Martian look like, whereas Martian Chronicles is more of a fantasy about this human imagination of the stars and sort of a meta science fiction. But in The Martians, you're able to present a lot of original sources of these cultural tropes, which I found really interesting. Did you have any favorites among those?
Oh, quite a few. Yeah. So, so when I was growing up in the 1960s, and watching Marvin the Martian and Bugs Bunny cartoons, there was a very popular sitcom called My Favorite Martian, starring Ray Walston, who played this Martian who came and crash landed his flying saucer in California, and he was pretending to be a human. He was kind of hiding out. But he had these antennae that would rise up from his head every once in a while. They were like television antennae. And sometimes you will see aliens depicted with antennae or Martians with antennae. And I long wondered where that came from. And that was one of the fun discoveries I made in the book because so back in the 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century, there were all sorts of depictions of what Martians might look like. And I can talk more about that in a minute. But that the antennae came along actually when a friend of Percival Lowell's named Edward Sylvester Morse, who was a prominent zoologist, and who got wrapped up in the whole Mars craze himself, went to Flagstaff to look through Lowell's telescope and saw the canals on Mars. And being a zoologist, he thought, well, what would a being on Mars look like? After all, Mars is we they knew even then it was extremely dry, had a thin atmosphere, probably cold. Well, what kinds of creatures on Earth can live in those sorts of environments and might over the eons evolve to actually live in even drier place with an even thinner atmosphere? And Morse uh, realized that, well, no matter where you go on Earth, even the highest mountaintops or the driest deserts, you find ants. And so he thought, well, maybe the Martians are ant-like. And after he made that comment, you start seeing these antennae sprouting from the heads of the aliens as depicted. So that's where the whole antenna thing came from. But even today, I mean, what is the stereotypical depiction of a Martian, of not a Martian, but an alien just generally today? Well, often it's a skinny creature with a big bald head and giant eyes. Well, that's very much what the Martians were depicted like because, well, why? Well, Mars is farther from the Earth, farther from the sun than the Earth is. So daylight must be dim. Well, the Martians must have big eyes to capture more sunlight. Why are they tall and skinny? Well, on Mars, there's less force of gravity, so a creature could grow taller without all that weight pulling down on its bones and muscles. So you would allow it to grow taller. So Martians often had kind of big chests, well, because the air is thin on Mars. They need big lungs. But then there was this idea, and this also gets back to H.G. Wells and the War of the Worlds, that the Martians are essentially what humans will become in the future, because Mars was thought to be an older planet than Earth, where where intelligence and civilization emerged before it did on Earth, and it then kept going. So, well, what will we become in the future? Well, if Darwin's right that we evolved from small-headed hairy apes and now we have bigger heads and less hair, well, the Martians farther down that path will have really big heads and no hair. So they're bald with big heads. Yeah, so there were a lot of these interesting things about the depictions of Martians. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I really recommend that to people because there's a lot of just interesting cultural observation throughout the book. Um, so I know your time is short now. I wanted to end with another thing that just seemed interesting is that in your framing of the book, I've seen a lot of science journalism recently that seems a little bit Mars skeptical. People who say we'll probably never go there. It's probably a hell on. It's not a place for humans anyway. But at least in the early pages of the book, you don't seem to frame it that way yourself. You give the dedication to your book to my nieces and nephews. May your generation be the first to cross the ocean of interplanetary space. I want to give you a chance in closing to say any last things that you'd like to say about that, and maybe to comment on what you think Mars means for humans as a concern in the future.
Well, so you mentioned recent books. There was a wonderful recent book called A City on Mars, which is highly skeptical about ideas of colonizing Mars. But I should say, also points out that if we're going to go anywhere, Mars is the place. I mean, the moon and Mars are the only logical places to start setting up shop. And really, for long-term human habitation, Mars is the place. But it's going to be really, really, really difficult to figure out how to live there long term. So, Elon Musk is obviously a highly, highly controversial character. And but I'm thrilled by his promotion of the idea of going to Mars. That I should say, I think his ideas of colonizing Mars and setting up a city of 1 million people anytime soon is crazy. Mars is a place that will want to kill anyone who goes there. I mean, the atmosphere is so thin that not only do you need to breathe your own oxygen that you bring with you, but you need to wear a pressurized suit, and there are global dust storms that blanket the whole planet, and the soil is toxic, and there's radiation constantly bathing the surface of the planet. It's a dreadful place. On the other hand, I think Elon Musk is absolutely right that in the long term, if human beings are going to survive, we have to branch out from just Earth. And by that, I don't mean that we should give up on Earth by any means, or that, we have to accept that climate change or nuclear war is going to destroy our planet. I'm not saying that. But if we're going to survive for another couple billion years, which is a really long time, something's going to happen. An asteroid's going to strike the Earth. I mean, something awful will happen. So I'm talking really long term. Eventually, human beings, if we're going to survive, will need to branch out, and Mars is the logical next place. And if you accept that as true, somebody sometime is going to have to start that transition to being multiplanetary. So why not start now? And by starting, I mean, I hope we will see a few astronauts on Mars in my lifetime. I think it's going to be centuries before there's a colony there, and millennia before there's any idea of like terraforming Mars into something more Earth-like. But I'm excited by the prospect. I mean, so but at the same time, my book is my book is both a kind of an inspiring tale, because what happened 100 years ago, this Mars craze really did launch science fiction and launch our excitement about outer space. It's also a cautionary tale about how we can fool ourselves into believing things that aren't true because we so wish they were true. People were looking at Mars as a better world that we wished existed and they believed existed. Some of that's going on today, I think. When Elon Musk talks about Mars, he's talking about creating a better world there. It's going to be a more egalitarian kind of a techno utopia that will leave behind the problems of Earth. I think that is kidding ourselves, that somehow we can go to Mars and leave humanity's problems behind as opposed to bringing our problems to Mars. So we have to be cautious that Mars is this blank slate that we just draw on whatever we imagine will be there, that we want to be there. So if we're going to get to Mars, we have to be level-headed about it. But I'm all for giving it a go and hope that we'll get there before too long.
Okay, well, thank you, David, for your time, and I really recommend this book. It's a very good read, and even if you think you know the story, there's a lot of extra interest in there. So thank you again.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you, David.